Hello and welcome to Alan History Nerd. I hope component 1 went well, and here I am trying to do another one of these last minute revision videos to help everybody with component 2. So this is component 2 for 2024 for EDEXCEL A-level politics. And it's an interesting paper. There's lots of different things. I will be concentrating on the bits where I think there are gaps. I'll go through some bits in a little bit more detail. And then when it comes to the non-core ideology, the one my college does is nationalism. So that's one I'll be talking about. So over the last 2 years, there has been papers. And for the papers, I've done videos. Now, the one in 2022, they gave us the advanced information. So I did a whole thing where I covered all the stuff of the advanced information. In 2023, I did the inverse, where I looked at all the stuff that hadn't been on the paper and hadn't been in the advanced information, and produced a video based on that, on the kind of the best guess that if they hadn't done it in 2022, then they'd probably do it in 2023. So if you combine those two bits together, 2022 and 2023, then that should cover the whole lot, theoretically, the stuff that was in and stuff that wasn't in. And then also there is my my politics playlists, which are now enormous, and there is a component 2.1, which is also part of the main A-level politics one, that covers kind of every last little bit of it. Obviously, with the fact that we do nationalism as our non-core ideology. So obviously I haven't got anything on the other non-core ideologies. I'm really sorry, but I only limited time. Another big thing to remember going into component 2 is that you can't forget all that stuff you did in component 1. So this is the bit of the blurb from the exam board. In your answers, you should draw on relevant knowledge and understanding of the study of component 1, UK politics and core political ideas. You must consider this view and alternative views to the view in a balanced way. So that's kind of the blurb bit you always get on the question paper. So you can bring in stuff, you should bring in stuff. Make sure you bring in stuff from component 1. Hopefully that's all nice and fresh in your brain because you just don't examine it. So that should be relatively easy. So where are we now? So there's a bit I've just talked about where we kind of played fill the gaps in 22 and 23. As I always say, the best preparation is to go through the whole specification bullet point by bullet point, something my videos do, but make sure you get the spec in front of you, you go through a guide. I know your teachers will have given you stuff out on all of this, and concentrate on the areas that you are less confident in your revision. That might be stuff that I touch on, it might be other stuff on top of that. Make sure as part of your revision you are testing your recall. Do flashcards, do knowledge dumps, anything like that. Or you go to the kind of the traditional old favourite and do a load of past paper questions. And I'm going to talk about some of the past papers in this video. The health warning bit. So I'm going to talk about possible gaps and trends and things I think are likely. I have no special insider knowledge. They can ask anything relating to any bullet point in the specification. They can repeat themselves. You'll see as I go through stuff, they do repeat themselves. The exam board aims to make their papers unpredictable to try and stop people, teachers like myself and students like you, from knowing exactly what's going to be on the next exam. So everything I go through in terms of any predictions I make might well be wrong. I'm not claiming to have any inside track or any greater knowledge than anybody else on this, but I think it's worth having a look at some of these bits and picking out some trends. So if we look at the first section of the spec on the Constitution, then they seem to particularly love asking source questions on this bit of the spec. So we have seen source questions in every year other than 2021 that we can say they relate to this. When it's got to do with stuff to do with the changing Constitution, they seem to particularly love devolution. So that technically is 1.3, but obviously it overlaps. If you can see 1.2 and 1.3, 1.2, how the Constitution has changed since 97. Well, a lot of the changes to the Constitution since 97 have been devolution, and 1.3, the role and power of the devolved body. So I've often, in all of these, I've kind of doubled those up. So they're not two different questions. They are. I've just kind of doubled up those, and kind of, it relates to both 1.2 and 1.3. 1.4, the debates on further reform. We'll have a look at 1.4 in a minute, but the idea of the UK Constitution needing major change, the idea that we should bring in entrenched codified constitution going forward. It all comes in 1.4. Also relates to stuff in 1.1, and I'm going to look at 1.1 in a bit more detail as well. So one bit I would say, looking at that, they love a source on the Constitution, which we all love a bit of Constitution. Now, it might well be that they go away from sources and they ask a bit more essays, but let's have a look at 1.1. Now, the 1.1s or 2.1s, 3.1s, 4.1s, the point ones are often the bit, I think, where you look at the spec and go, how do you get questions out of that in the same way as you can do from the other bits? So the opposite is the kind of the last bit of each section, where there's often real debate stuff for questions. So you have to have an overview of the development of the Constitution through key historical documents. So you've got the Magna Carta, Bill of Rights, Acts of Settlement, Acts of Union, Parliament Act, the European Communities Act, and then obviously you can add Brexit onto the end of that one. Now, I don't know, could they ask a question like, which is your favourite? Which is what you think is the most important? I think it's difficult to get a politics question rather than a history question out of that. But you have to know it. That it could be significant things relating to it, particularly, for example, in sources and things like that. The nature of the UK Constitution, so all the bit, I'm sure you'll cover this in a lot of detail, that it's unentrenched, it's uncodified, it's unitary, the twin pillars of parliamentary sovereignty and the rule of law. You can also then bring in some of your ideology stuff from component 1 about what liberals and conservatives would say about all of this. If you're doing component 3 like we do, then you obviously you'll have in your mind the US example as kind of the opposite. And then you're told you need to know the 5 main sources of the UK Constitution: statute law, common law, conventions, authoritative works, treaties, including European Union law. Probably not quite that last bit anymore. So what could they ask relating to 1.1? It's hard, as I said, it's hard to see very obvious questions. Much of this is knowledge rather than debate. They could ask whether the twin pillars of parliamentary sovereignty and the rule of law are being upheld. I mean, there's lots of examples from recent years in terms of the governments have been really breaking the law. We see this in a programme of Parliament by Boris Johnson, the adjustments to the protocols, non-binding protocols with the Internal Markets Bill by Boris Johnson, the Partygate by Boris Johnson, and then you've got the clashes with Rishi Sunak and with the courts over the Rwanda plan, and groups saying that they think the Rwanda plan it would break bits of international law. So there definitely is plenty of examples and stuff that you can get in there that can really get you that you can get a good question out of the extent to which the rule of law is being upheld in the UK Constitution in recent years. There are arguments about the Parliament being sovereign, especially with the power of the executive, particularly at moments where there is a large government majority. So again, 2019, if we go back to that, the Conservative Party had a very large majority. It's kind of whittled down fairly dramatically in the years since. And as I make this video, we've obviously had the very recent announcement there's going to be a general election. So all that could change fairly quickly. But there is a debate there. So that's one that you could be asked to look at. The comparative significance of the main sources of the UK Constitution: statute law, common law, conventions, authoritative works, treaties. I mean, they could ask to what extent is blah the most significant source of the UK Constitution. Now, European law is no longer a source of the UK Constitution, apart from the fact it's been adopted into UK law largely. I'd argue statute law is the most important due to parliamentary sovereignty, linking back to the earlier bit of the spec. I mean, conventions and things can be overridden, but they all play a role. So in learning what the roles of these sources are, then if a question came up on that, it's fairly straightforward to get yourself prepared, I think. So 1.2 they like a lot in terms of the devolution stuff, but there are, I think, some gaps in here. They haven't asked about it. Obviously, the Fixed Term Parliaments Act is a tricky one because it came into existence and then went away again. So it no longer exists. Hence, Rishi Sunak calling the election when he wanted to. House of Lords reform seems to have gone a bit quiet. There is debate about the Human Rights Act, but again would make a better question if the Conservatives had brought in an alternative, which they did talk about, but they never actually did. Now, I'm particularly interested in the bit I've highlighted in bold. Any major reforms undertaken by the government since 2015, including further devolution to Scotland in the context of the Scottish referendum. Obviously, if we keep going, then the spec's set in time, really, but things get going on. So the big thing that has happened, which is a massive constitutional change since 1997, is Brexit. And this might be the time for them to ask a nice big question on it. So it has clearly had a big impact on the UK Constitution. It's removed the European Communities Act of 1972 and EU law from the UK Constitution, and therefore it has, and one of the arguments for doing it in the first place was that it would reinforce parliamentary sovereignty. It has placed a huge strain on the UK Constitution, as we saw the executive battling Parliament, which was great fun, as government couldn't get anything through, and Parliament started trying to take over, and we saw Bercow going back to precedents, I think going all the way back to Tudor times, and making some controversial calls. There's also challenges in the courts, notably Gina Miller going back to 2016. We saw the proroguing of Parliament by Boris Johnson, which raised constitutional issues because he was dragging the monarch into party politics and testing the power of the Supreme Court. The European Court of Justice no longer has jurisdictional power in the UK. Now, arguably, the EU Withdrawal Act simply transferred EU law into UK law. There's 40 years worth of law, so it's going to take a long time to properly unpack that and say that it's genuinely gone and been replaced by UK law. The EU Withdrawal Act, it was seen as controversial in that it seemed to shift the balance on lawmaking towards ministers through delegated legislation, suggesting a growth in delegated powers. So there's all this EU statute law that comes in. There's no way all of it can be debated in Parliament. There's far too much of it, and so a lot of the interweaving it and interpreting it and changing it is left to ministers. So therefore, these delegated powers have grown. Obviously, the EU remains the UK's biggest export market. Then this means that many UK companies will still have to continue to follow EU rules. It's just UK politicians will have no say in what those rules are. But if you are a company that either exports to the EU or works across the UK and the EU, then you're going to have to meet EU standards and EU regulations on things, regardless of what the UK Parliament says, if you want to sell in the EU, which is a massive market and the biggest export market for the UK. It has ignited further constitutional debate surrounding devolution. So that there is the argument made, particularly by the SNP, that Brexit has been imposed on Scotland against its will, that Scotland voted to remain and has been dragged out. And this has then led to further arguments for independence. It's also created massive problems in Northern Ireland regarding the Good Friday Agreement, because part of the Good Friday Agreement it says there can be no solid border between the Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, but the Republic of Ireland is in the EU and Northern Ireland is not, and therefore EU's legislation would suggest there should be a solid border. And there's been all kinds of mess going on through that, with again going back to the idea of areas where we talked about the rule of law falling down, where the UK has come very close to, or according to some, gone too far in terms of international law, with some of the bits it's brought in terms of change parts of the withdrawal agreement regarding Northern Ireland. There's also a big bit in it about the non-binding nature of referendums in the UK Constitution. I mean, obviously there would have been absolute outrage, and there was outrage at the concept that Parliament or the government might decide not to bring in the referendum, but they are simply non-binding in nature. And then the ideas of codification and installing a Bill of Rights have been raised, as some of these issues are no longer protected by rights no longer protected by EU membership. And the codification kind of goes, well, actually, we are now creating UK as a sovereign nation, then maybe we should. This is the moment to sit down and write a codified constitution, and then there's all the arguments on that. So there is loads here to go at. So again, and it relates to a later bit of the specification, which I'll mention again as we get to it. And so I think this is an area to make sure that you are prepped for and that you can talk about. As I said, there is loads in there. There's been lots happening. There's tons of news. So again, really good for your AO1 stuff, where you'll be able to pull out loads and loads of examples. Really good for your relating it to paper one stuff, because you've got all the stuff where you can relate it to parties and pressure groups and all that kind of stuff as well. So 1.4, as I mentioned, it is the big one where the debates come from. So fundamentally, this kind of suggests that the major debates that could go into a question. So the extent to which devolution should be extended in England would be, again, a really good question. There's been stuff relating to that already. And whether the UK constitution should be changed to be entrenched and codified, including a Bill of Rights. Again, I've done videos on that. That has been well trodden. We've seen that on the grid that we've looked at. Those questions have been asked on. Again, the entrenched and codified bit possibly more so than the Bill of Rights bit. So again, there are areas there to make sure you are revising. If we move on to section 2 and look at Parliament, again, we can see a good selection of questions across. The less of a bias in this one towards source questions. We've got more of a kind of a mixture. So 2.1 again, it is that bit where it seems mainly kind of knowledge, where it's the structure and roles of the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And so we've got a question there: the roles and membership of the House of Lords requires reform. We've got the comparative powers bit. I've had a question that the House of Lords is less powerful than the House of Commons, but has more influence on decisions. We had one on the respective functions of the House of Lords can be seen they're more successful carrying out their functions than the House of Commons is. There's a bit of a gap, I think, in 2.3. There was a question in 2022. Parliament is largely ineffective in shaping government legislation. That's the only one, as far as I can see, that you could really say is a 2.3 question. We've got 2.4, which looks at Parliament's interactions with the executive, and 2.4, again, it's that final bit of any section seems to be the one where you get the most debates in, and we can see 3 questions out of this. One on backbench MPs, and then we've got one on the executive dominating Parliament, and then one on select committees as the most effective way that the House of Commons can hold the executive to account. So if we look at then at 2.4, this is one we say, well, this is where we get a lot of the debate out of it. Well, the significance of backbenchers has been there in 2020, though there hasn't been anything directly on the importance of parliamentary privilege, so you might well have talked about it in that question. There's been a question in 2023 on select committees. There hasn't been questions on the role and significance of the opposition or the purpose and nature of ministerial question time, including Prime Minister's questions. So I think it's worth having a look at some of those elements. So the importance of parliamentary privilege. Well, parliamentary privilege means essentially you can say anything you like in Parliament and not be legally held account for it. You might get in trouble with the Speaker. You might get in problems with kind of having broken some of the standards, but you can face no legal ramifications. So a kind of a good example of this is John Hemming, who named Ryan Giggs and others who had brought out these super injunctions. Now, breaking the super injunctions was deemed to be a criminal offence. So there were, John Hemming and others believe this to be a massive kind of restraint on the press and freedom of speech. And so he mentioned them in Parliament, which meant essentially all the media could report the fact that he'd said it in Parliament, and everybody was free from criminal prosecution. So it kind of really broke down that. you might see if you watch things like Have I Got News for You, then I think there was one on fairly recently with Jess Phillips, the Labour MP, was on there, and they were trying to get her to say something controversial. And she said, "Well, I'm not going to say anything here. Maybe I'll just say it in Parliament, because again, in Parliament she couldn't be sued for libel or slander or anything like that." Now, this leads us on to another example. So in 2018, Peter Hain in the House of Lords broke an injunction taken by Philip Green, who are in Topshop, over various serious allegations that have been made against him. He faced no legal action, but the Lord Chief Justice spoke out against this, saw this as an attack on the rule of law, which, again, relating back to one of our earlier bits in the spec, because he said there was no justification for doing this. Is Peter Hain is just making use of a parliamentary privilege. Now, it's important parliamentary privilege is there so that members of Parliament can raise issues and speak very, very freely. Now, one of the bits you might have to judge is whether, in these two examples, John Hemming and Peter Hain are taking it too far, and therefore it's damaging to the rule of law. Now, within Parliament, conduct is looked after by the Parliamentary Committee for Standards. There's been some kind of real controversy stuff on standards in Parliament. Again, it's slightly off the question, but I think it's the kind of stuff that it's worth noting, and that you could use some good examples on. So one of the most notable controversies recently has been the Owen Paterson case. He broke the rules. The government tried to block his suspension, and instead looked to overhaul the standards watchdog that had pointed out that he'd broken all the standards, and before performing a dramatic U-turn in the face of media scrutiny on it, and Paterson was gone. The Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards, Daniel Greenberg, has expressed concerns in the past about MPs' lack of responsiveness to constituents and the tone that they use in social media. And there are a whole range of MPs who are under investigation for breaking various rules. So there is definitely room, I think, for a question about parliamentary privilege and parliamentary standards. There's loads of stuff that's been going on in recent parliaments and going back in time, where you could get lots of other examples of the standards maintained by Parliament and Parliament's ability to regulate itself. Again, I think all areas which are of interest. Another area that again is not yet had a question on it, which is a possibility, is the role and significance of the opposition. We now have a situation where there are 20 opposition days devoted to issues chosen by the opposition, and different parties get different numbers of these depending on their size. There was recent controversy when Labour was seen to take over an SNP day, and with the vote, and there was the Speaker made a controversial call which allowed a Labour amendment, which kind of killed what was going on, because so Labour didn't want the SNP motion to kind of split their party, and they kind of kiboshed it, and the Speaker was seen as being complicit, and he had to apologise to Parliament. So the opposition days, they are important in terms of stuff like that going on. One of the difficulties I would point out to these is realistically what's going to happen. So is the opposition going to raise an issue, and the government's just going to say, oh, actually we were wrong, we should let that in. So it's a difficult one. The main opposition should be the government in waiting, and Keir Starmer would be getting very exciting at this particular moment about saying yes, we are. And that's for the voters to judge in the next or over the next few weeks. The key role of opposition is calling the government to account, asking questions of ministers and challenging their policies. They also have a role in defending the interests of groups in society which are aligned to them, or are facing discrimination or being badly treated for not being aligned with the government. So they can be protecting groups either kind of within those that are connected to them, or just wider groups in general, if they feel that the government is mistreating different groups. They have a ceremonial function on national events such as Remembrance Day. And the role of opposition can be hugely significant if you have things like a minority government that you had in 2017 to 2019. Now, Rishi Sunak has said he thinks there's a strong possibility of a hung parliament in 2024, and we'll wait and see on that one. But there are examples in the past where we've seen failures of governments gaining minorities. So 2017 to 2019, we see minority government. 2010, when we see the coalition government. And again, so opposition in those parts can play a more significant role. All links into the stuff with parties and other bits from Unit 1. And again, a good area for a question about something like to what extent are opposition parties in Parliament powerless, or something like that, would make a really good question. There's loads of stuff to go out with it. Would be a nice one to get. So the other bit from this section, which I think has not directly had a question on it, is about the nature of primary ministerial questions. So obviously there was one on select committees, and you could say, well, the other types of questioning is the alternative to it. So this all fits in. I think again, it's all useful stuff. So there are questions to ministers' days. Each minister takes it in turn to face questions from members. There's some controversy recently over this with Cameron's appointment as Foreign Secretary, because he's in the House of Lords, not the House of Commons, and therefore you've got this really unusual situation where you've got a really high-ranking minister as Foreign Minister, but he doesn't face the Commons because he's not in the Commons, he's in the Lords. Ministers also have to respond to written questions that will often relate to constituents or pressure groups or particular issues that a Member of Parliament is interested in. Probably more effective questioning comes from the Select Committees and Public Accounts Committee. They tend to be fairly hostile at times. Remember, the committees are made up proportionally in relation to the size of the parties. They tend to be more significant to the questions of the House, with ministers kind of being more held to account, but less likely to be able to avoid questions by a kind of turn of phrase, or a simple just avoiding them when asked directly in Parliament. If they're asked in a committee, they're more likely to be pinned down. And again, the committee members tend to have a particular area of expertise or interest in the on the areas of the committee they're on cover. Prime Minister's question time, I think, is almost kind of the opposite. And so every kind of Wednesday lunchtime during Parliament, it seems to be more publicity, more political theatre, more about sound bites than effective democracy. So it's who can get the wittiest one-liner onto the news that night, rather than anything particularly serious, and lots of MPs putting people off politics by making silly noises and waving things in the background, and then asking members of the government backbenches asking sycophantic questions, and the opposition just trying to score points. The Prime Minister also appears in front of the Liaison Committee, which is made up of the chairs of the main committees twice a year. And again, you could contrast those two bits. Is kind of, well, which of those two holds the Prime Minister accountable? Well, one happens far more frequently than the other, but maybe the chairs of the main committees are more likely to be able to pin the Prime Minister down and get some proper some proper stuff at them. Worth looking at some details and stuff and some examples from that. I mean, I think it's worth bearing in mind that ministers have a kind of an army of civil servants and advisors that support them in answering questions, particularly if they get written questions, preparing for question days and things like that. So there is an idea that almost questions in Parliament is a case of amateurs, the MPs, facing professionals, the ministers, who have all this kind of support and backing and research and stuff behind them, and so that the MPs are at a massive disadvantage. Now, there is an argument that is less likely to be the case in the Select Committee, where you might actually find members of the Select Committee have greater expertise than any minister. Remember, ministers are often non-specialists. So a well-established minister who's well briefed by the civil servants and advisors might have a huge advantage answering a question in front of an MP, in front of MPs. A kind of recently appointed minister who's just finding their feet facing a well-established Select Committee might be something very different. And there's also the case of what we might call the big beast. So the people who are really experienced members of the front benches may have held multiple roles over numerous years, and have a huge amount of expertise in it. If they're the MP then asking the question of the newly appointed minister, then that can cause problems for the minister, because they aren't going to be able to use that thing of greater expertise and knowledge, because the chances are that the former minister with umpteen years of experience will trump their experience and knowledge of what's going on. Moving on to section 3, so this is the Prime Minister and the Executive. So again, 3.1, and we often see this with these, there's a big gap in 3.1, the structure, role and powers of the Executive, but a lot of that underpins the other types of questions that we've had in there. So we've had we had a source question in 2023. Power lies with the Prime Minister rather than Cabinet. A lovely question, really nice one that last year. In 2022, we've got stuff on individual ministerial responsibility and collective responsibility, which covered 3.2 really nicely, which was a big gap which we spotted back then. In 2021, this area seems to be largely ignored, which is interesting. So since 2010, we see the return to cabinet government. In 2020, in 2019, prime ministers have too much power, which reflects on a lot of this. Again, 3.1, it's really difficult, I think, to see how you get questions out of it. There's loads of lovely stuff about prime minister, the comparing the power of the prime minister and the cabinet, which is in 3.3 and 3.3.1. Now, then you go on to 3.3.2, which is the one about dictating policy, and a lot of that fits into having done some work on some case studies. Now, 3.1, again, that's difficult to get questions out of. The structure, including Prime Minister, Cabinet, Junior Ministers and Government Departments. So that's just knowledge. You just need to know that stuff. And that might be helpful in answering any question in this section. So you need to know their main roles and their main powers. Now they might ask you something about, is this their main role? Is this their main power? Or most important of their powers, most significant of their powers, most significant of their roles? So you need to know what they are and what they do, and then think about that in that comparative way. So, main roles, proposing legislation, proposing a budget, making policy decisions within laws and budgets. The main powers, royal prerogative powers, initiation of a legislation and secondary legislation. So they could ask you some stuff about how significant comparatively those are. So, I mean, I think 3.1 is a difficult one to ask on, but really they're the two ways they could go in it, is by going, to what extent is this role the most significant? To what extent is this power the most significant? And so, again, it's something worth spending a bit of time prepping. In 3.3.2, this is the one which is the case studies. You guys might be able to address this in 20, 30 years' time and decide another election is the centre of the universe. But it seems to be, I'm guessing whoever wrote the spec is someone roughly my age who kind of goes, right, well, I can divide the world into before 1997 and after 1997, because 1997 was the year that all politics went bonkers. And a massive kind of central bit of a load of the spec. So maybe when you're writing the spec in 20 years' time, then you'll make it so. 30 years' time, you'll make it so the centre of everything is the 2024 election, and whatever that brings us. So you need to know at least one prime minister from 45 to 97 in detail, so you can give older examples to show how things have changed. I think when we do it, the one we tend to concentrate on is Thatcher, but it doesn't have to be Thatcher. You can do any of the other prime ministers. I think anybody who studies the A-level history paper of 1951 to 2007 has an enormous enormous advantage at this point, where they might know loads of the prime ministers in loads of detail. So pick a prime minister and then one post 97. You might want to go Blair, or you might want to go Cameron, or you might want to go Johnson. You might go bang up to date and do Sunak. I wouldn't do Liz Truss. There's not a lot there. You could do the lettuce instead, but again, I don't think that would pick you up many marks. So I'd pick a prime minister who had a decent length of time in office and did lots of stuff. So you got loads of examples. They covering both events, policies, and examples through both control and lack of control. So it's told you need to do it. It's in the spec. So make sure you know them. So you have to have one pre-97 and one post-97. The problem in the very modern era is quite how short-lived all our prime ministers are, which means that there's probably a little bit less in there. But again, I don't know. If you're using just Blair and Thatcher as examples, there would be a bit of a worry it wasn't completely up to date. So it is worth doing some bang up to date ones. We move on to section 4. So the relation between the branches, which is really the crux of this whole unit, really, is all the different branches of UK government and how they interact. They do love the Supreme Court. So if you look at 4.1, there's the Supreme Court and its interactions with an influence over legislative and policy-making process. So we've got 2020, the Supreme Court has too much power and influence. We've got it strengthening parliamentary sovereignty in 21. We've got it operating with judicial independence and neutrality in 2022. They had a little break from it, so they may well come back. They do love a Supreme Court question. The relationship between the executive and parliament, this absolutely is the crux of all of it. So we've had backbench MPs, we've had executive dominating parliament, we have had parliament is ineffective in shaping legislation, we've had select committees, an effective way to hold the executive to account. All of those we can pick out at 4.2, and they also relate to other bits of the spec as well. Right, 4.3, unsurprisingly, has gone really quiet because it is the aims, roles and impact of the European Union on UK government, and there was a question on it in 2019. Very wisely, they've left it alone since. Now, the impact of leaving the EU now, I think, is a big one, and we looked at the Brexit stuff in detail earlier. I wouldn't be surprised if that was to turn up. The location of sovereignty in the UK system, again, there's lots of stuff that could be asked on that, but a lot of it comes back to really, does it lie with Parliament, which to me is the obvious question, because we're told that's the fundamental of our constitution right at the beginning of the unit, or is it the executive or somebody else? So there's some interesting stuff in all of that, and this section I think is again absolutely central to the whole thing with this unit. So they've altered 4.3 over the years, understandably. So the aims of the EU, including the 4 freedoms of the single market. They got rid of social policy out of that bit. So you need to know the aims of the EU. I'm sure they're going to ask you a question. Tell us the 4 aims, the 4 freedoms of the single market. They're not going to ask you that. Now, what they have added on is the impact of leaving the EU on UK parliamentary sovereignty and in relation to policy making. So I've talked about some of the EU stuff earlier. A lot of that stuff, I've related it a bit to constitution. Now you can relate it to policy making and sovereignty in the same way. It's highly interrelated. It's a lot of the same stuff. So they could hit 2 bits of the spec at the same time with a lovely question on the impact of Brexit, and they might frame it in a solely constitutional way. They might frame it more in a policy making and parliamentary sovereignty kind of a way. Any of those would make good questions. Be prepared for that one. That might well be coming. Now, onto the core ideologies. This is only relevant for those of you who have been doing nationalism. There's a really weird bit here where they seem to really like the 2019 questions and ask them again in 2023 with a little bit of a twist. So they twisted the society one a little bit, and they just reversed the progressive regressive one. So we've had progressive regressive, we've had society several times, nationalism more united than divided. It's a chameleon ideology. That's a really good one. Pessimism, we had a nice human nature one. Is nationalism expansionist? Well, some of it is, and some of it isn't. Some of it opposes expansion. So we've had a state one. Now we've got the kind of common view of what a nation is, which is a wonderful broad question where you get loads of lovely stuff in. Consistent view of self-determination. Well, it doesn't, because if you're morass, then France can take anybody else's self-determination off them. And then you've got people who are very passionate about self-determination, like Herder and Mazzini, who are writing as nationalists as their nations on the cusps of being formed into united countries. So there's been some really good questions in this area. Again, I don't know whether they're going to repeat the 2020 questions next year, because they repeated the 2020 in 2023. They repeated the 2019 ones. Are there any gaps? Well, there are some gaps. One I would particularly look at is inclusive exclusive, so the extent to which the different forms of nationalism exclude people or include them in society. So, for example, civic nationalism and the liberal nationalism is very, very inclusive. Garveyism is a wonderful debatable one on this one, because in some ways it kind of goes all cultures, groups, languages from the whole of Africa. We're going to include that all together, and then there is some exclusivity in it based on race. There is lots of stuff to do with race with this. So links to race is an important one. Inclusive, exclusive, I say there's race on that, but there's also all kinds of other things. There's normally certain things that make you a member of a nation according to the different nationalists. It's a wonderfully broad one. So Herder, it's language and culture, but if you're not a native speaker of that, home speaker of that language, then you're not in that nation. Race, you've definitely got morass on that one. Obviously, liberal nationalism that has no link to race is debatable with people like Herder, because you kind of go, well, he talks about culture, shared history, and language. Well, then none of those are race, but often when his ideas have been used, particularly when they're used in Germany later on, particularly by groups like the Nazis, then they imposed race on it. Economy. If not asked on economy, be prepared. It's not a nice one if they were to ask it, because several of the nationalist theorists have really very little, if anything, to say on the economy. You've got the whole idea of nativism, this idea that nationalists tend to want to protect their one nation, their economy. So things like America First in America under Trump, where they want to protect their own economy, they tend to be anti-immigration. But that's not the case for all nationalists. And if you look at liberal nationalism in particular, then it would talk about embracing people coming to the country. It would also talk about kind of thriving international communities of collaborating nation states. And so, yeah, it's not an easy one, that one, but one to be ready for. And then just make sure you can contrast across the branches, looking at similarities and differences. So from liberal nationalism to conservative nationalism to post-colonial nationalism and expansionist nationalism, make sure you know all your key thinkers in loads and loads of detail, and then you should be able to deal with anything they put their way. And again, the good thing on this is there's going to be a question on nationalism or whatever your core ideology is, so you can be massively prepared, and you get a choice out of two. So if they ask a real stinker, for example, on the economy, you can always do the other one, but make sure you're ready on that one anyway. Okay, right. So again, it's been a slightly epic one. Unit 2 is a big unit. There's lots and lots of stuff in there. I hope that's been helpful. Best of luck to all of you with the exam. Make sure you check out all my Unit 2 videos, and then there'll be another one of these coming for Unit 3A on America, which is the unit we do. I won't be doing one on the global one, I'm afraid, because I don't know it, I don't teach it. But there's loads of stuff on the channel for both Unit 2 and Unit 3A. And then obviously, if you're a historian, get on there and look at all the history stuff as well. If you're not a historian, once you finish your politics exams, just watch those history videos, just for the fun of it. There's even ancient history stuff now. Right, excellent. Thank you very much for watching. Best of luck in your exams.